Hey guys, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of our next presidential series installment, taking a look at the 31st president of the United States, Herbert Hoover. Mr. We could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. So part 2, here we go. Welcome. Hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday, looking at the young life and political rise of Herbert Hoover. Now in part 2, of course, we're going to be taking a look at his presidency, his legacy, his death, and of course the gravesite, burial site of where Herbert Hoover is laid to rest. I am flying solo, as I said, so I'm going to jump right in here and kind of just get into it. First thing I always kind of like to try to start off with is the election. So let's start with the presidential election of 1928. To be completely honest with you, Hoover kind of walked away with this in 1928. It was not really, he easily won it. Herbert Hoover ran as a Republican with Charles Curtis in the election of 1928, and they easily beat Alfred Smith, the first Catholic to run for the office. He received 444 out of 531 electoral votes. So, it was a pretty handily easy election win for Hoover. As you can see here on your screen, I'm sure I'm showing like maps and that sort of thing. Just to really give you the breakdown, Hoover had 444 electoral votes. Al Smith had 87. Herbert Hoover carried 40 states. Smith carried 8. The popular vote, Hoover had 21.4 million votes. It was actually 58.2% of the popular vote is the percentage. I mean, he won everything. The only thing that Smith won was kind of the southern states that you'll see here. Looks like Louisiana, and those kind of states. Alabama, Georgia, states like that it looks like that Smith carried. Other than that, all over the country. Oh, and I take that back. It looks like maybe, is it Rhode Island? No, it looks like Massachusetts. Rhode Island and Massachusetts as well went to Smith. But other than that, I mean, it was a landslide. It really was. This was not close. It was a pretty overwhelming win. So now we're going to get into kind of the synopsis of what was what he was all about. What was Hoover all about? As I like to do, I really try to be as thorough as I can with this stuff. If I miss some stuff that I wanted to touch on, I will go back and I will touch on it. One thing I did want to mention quickly before I move on to the other stuff. Herbert Hoover, when he was elected, he became the first Quaker president. As I had told you, he was the son of a blacksmith, Jesse Clark Hoover, and a Quaker minister, Huldah Minthorn Hoover. Both his parents were dead by the time he was 9. He was separated from his siblings and lived with relatives where he continued to be raised in the Quaker faith. And yes, he was a Quaker. Pretty interesting stuff that he's the first Quaker president that we ever had. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to give you kind of an overview, a synopsis, if you will, of the Herbert Hoover presidency. And then we'll go into some fun facts and that sort of thing like we always do. And then, of course, we will read from The President is Dead by Louis McComb, this great, wonderful, amazing book. If you haven't already, I think I've mentioned this for, what are we at, the 31st president? I've probably mentioned this for like 20 straight weeks now. Please go pick up The President is Dead. Go, if you're a fan of this, if you like this channel and you especially enjoy the presidential grave sites and the burial and the death and where they died and, all that kind of interesting stuff, please go pick up The President is Dead. Go on Amazon or wherever, buy it. It's worth it. You will not regret it. It is amazing. Go do it. So we'll read from that later on regarding the death and everything of Hoover. But here we go. The presidency of Herbert Hoover. The torch of conservative leadership was passed to Herbert Hoover, Coolidge and Harding's well-respected Secretary of Commerce. On the morning of March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover was inaugurated as a storm moved over the nation's capital, soaking the crowd of thousands that had gathered to watch the 31st President of the United States take the oath of office. The gloomy weather would turn out to be a harbinger of things to come. Everyone expected great things from Herbert Hoover. His basic mantra was rugged individualism. He is a guy orphaned at a young age. He becomes a mining engineer. By the time he's in his mid-30s, he is wealthy. He's a multi-millionaire. We have had presidents who were politicians, of course. We have had presidents who were lawyers. We have had presidents who were generals. But Herbert Hoover is the one conspicuous illustration of a businessman president, until recently with Donald Trump. But Hoover, raised as a Quaker, found his real calling in public service and politics. He was called the Great Humanitarian because of his enormous feats of organization at the end of World War I and in preventing famine in Europe and the Soviet Union. When he ran for the presidency, he promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. He sort of assumed that he would oversee the beginning of perpetual prosperity. America's unprecedented economic boom had fueled an explosive uptick in the nation's stock market. Between 1920 and 1929, an increasing number of wealthy and upper middle class people put their money in the stock market. As a result, stock values on average rose as much as 400%. You know, if he had been elected in 1920, Herbert Hoover would have been a great president, perhaps on the order of a Theodore Roosevelt. But it was his misfortune to be the right man at the wrong time. On October 24th of 1929, just 7 months into Hoover's term, the market crashed. It kicked off a week of frenzied trading as investors ran for the exits, and the market lost 23% of its value. There is a general consensus that speculation, growing disparities of wealth, and a lack of regulation, all policies pursued by Republican presidents in the 1920s, contributed to both the crash and the Depression. Nobody knew that we were entering the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover's first idea was to do nothing. He talked about it like it was a hurricane, like it was something that swept through. It will cleanse the economy. Instead, the economy went off a cliff. More than 600 banks closed, businesses went under because they could not get any loans, and people were thrown out of work. A lot of what people just wanted from Hoover was relief, and he felt that was not the government's job, that if the government tried to interfere in the economy, it might make things worse. Unemployment jumped 5% between 1929 and 1930, and another 7% the year after that. Construction ground to a halt. Corporate earnings dried up, and by 1932, the nation's gross domestic product had plunged 44%. While middle-class Americans were losing their jobs and were desperate, instead of agreeing that the national government had to establish some kind of welfare system, Hoover tried to persuade the Red Cross to step up to the plate and to help the American people. That just completely discredited Hoover. He takes certain steps, but it's always too little, it's always too late. He puts his foot in his mouth. Herbert Hoover said, well, you know, nobody is starved. But in fact, people did starve during the Depression. It was called the Hoover Depression, and homeless camps were called Hoovervilles. Sounds like something out of Dr. Seuss. Whoville, right? You know, like Cindy Lou Who. It sounds something right out of a Dr. Seuss book. Hoovervilles. So as this went on, Hoover just became more isolated and more lonely. Hoover turns to his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and he says, "Can I borrow a nickel to call a friend?" And Andrew Mellon says, "Here, take a dime. Call them all." Yeah, it wasn't a good time for Herbert Hoover. He definitely went through some really rough stuff. The Great Depression, obviously, it just did not go well for Hoover at all, really at all. So yeah, I mean, as far as the Depression goes, on taking office, Hoover said that given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Having seen the fruits of prosperity brought by technological progress, many shared Hoover's optimism, and the already bullish stock market climbed even higher on Hoover's accession. You know, as I said, the crash happened, and it just was not good. It really was not good. Just didn't go well. It really did not go well at all. He did run for re-election in 1932, but he was destroyed. I mean, literally destroyed. That's obviously Franklin Roosevelt won the election of 1932, and it was bad. It was really bad. He didn't even come close to getting reelected. Some other things that he dealt with, civil rights and the Mexican repatriation. Hoover seldom mentioned civil rights while he was president. He believed that African Americans and other races could improve themselves with education and individual initiative. Hoover appointed more African Americans to federal positions than Harding and Coolidge had combined. But many African American leaders condemned various aspects of the Hoover administration, including Hoover's unwillingness to push for a federal anti-lynching law. Hoover also continued to pursue the Lily White strategy, removing African Americans from positions of leadership in the Republican Party in an attempt to end the Democratic Party's dominance in the South. Though Robert Moton and some other black leaders accepted the Lily White strategy as a temporary measure, most African American leaders were outraged. Hoover further alienated black leaders by nominating conservative Southern judge John J. Parker to the Supreme Court. Parker's nomination ultimately failed in the Senate due to opposition from the NAACP and organized labor. Many black voters switched to the Democratic Party in the 1932 election, and African Americans would later become an important part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. As part of his efforts to limit unemployment, Hoover sought to cut immigration to the United States, and in 1930, he promulgated an executive order requiring individuals to have employment before migrating to the United States. So yeah, he didn't do too much in the way of, civil rights and that sort of thing. Prohibition on taking office. Hoover urged Americans to obey the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which had established prohibition across the United States. So he told people to definitely make sure they followed that when he first took office. Now, let's discuss a little bit of some fun facts and some other facts regarding Hoover and the presidency. So some fun facts about Hoover. He actually participated in the first long-distance television broadcast. Hoover served as Secretary of Commerce under Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge from 1921 to 1928, making him the last president to have held a full cabinet position. In this role, he became a popular and visible member of the government, which opened up a historic opportunity for him. On April 7th of 1927, Herbert Hoover gave a speech from Washington, D.C. He looked into a small black box and spoke into a telephone receiver for an experiment conducted by Bell Laboratories. This moving image was beamed more than 200 miles away to Whippany, New Jersey, and then onto the AT&T offices in Manhattan, making Hoover the first person to appear on a long-distance TV broadcast. A New York Times story recalled, "It was as if a photograph had come to life and begun to talk, smile, nod its head, and look this way and that." The broadcast was marred, in hindsight, by the appearance of vaudeville comedian A. Dolan, who first gave a performance as a stereotype of an Irish American, made a quick costume change, and then returned in blackface. Hoover, however, commented on the scientific significance of the event, telling reporters, "Human genius has now destroyed the impediment of distance." Herbert Hoover's presidency was actually his first elected office. Hoover made an abbreviated run at the presidency in 1920, but he never explicitly agreed to or participated in the brief campaign. The mostly nonpartisan Hoover entered the race in California largely on the issue of joining the League of Nations, something Hoover was for, but fellow progressive Republican Hiram Johnson was vehemently against. After Johnson won the California primary, Hoover left the race. Hoover was appointed Secretary of Commerce under Harding, and after 7 years, gave the White House another shot. His national popularity had peaked after he took charge of relief efforts following flooding along the Mississippi River in 1927. And when Coolidge announced he wouldn't seek re-election, Hoover became the leading Republican candidate, although he had once said the whole idea of political campaign filled him with complete revulsion. Although the party leadership didn't entirely trust Hoover, he had won enough primaries by the time of the Republican convention in Kansas City in the summer of 1928 to secure the support of multiple constituents and the important endorsement of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. In the general election, he easily defeated New York Governor Alfred E. Smith with 404 electoral votes to Smith's 87 and 58% of the popular vote. Then, of course, as I touched on, he lost to FDR, and he became one of FDR's biggest critics. Historians have commented on Hoover's unfortunate timing and poor policies as president. As he took office just a few months before the stock market crash of 1929, even the great engineer couldn't figure out a way to turn around the economy. The Hawley-Smoot tariff bill didn't work. The Agricultural Marketing Act did nothing. His voluntary, non-governmental approach to economics failed to stimulate consumption and production, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was unsuccessful in stabilizing the financial sector. Americans rallied around FDR and his New Deal promises, and he knocked out Hoover with 57% of the popular vote and a whopping 472 to 59 electoral vote edge. Becoming the scapegoat for the Great Depression didn't sit well with Herbert Hoover, and he blasted his successor's policies and ideology. Hoover also felt Roosevelt jabbed him with personal slights. Hoover's request for Secret Service protection was denied, and he believed FDR fed negative stories to the press that blocked his fundraising efforts to aid Finland in its fight with Russia. Many of Hoover's knocks on Roosevelt have not aged well. His main criticisms concerned the gospel of dictatorship surrounding the support of the New Deal. He even compared what was happening in America to events in Europe, namely that this administration is steadily developing the same growth of personal power that has swept the world into Nazism and fascism. Hoover didn't just think about politics, though. He continued his humanitarian work and wrote extensively, including The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, the first biography of one president written by another, and Fishing for Fun and To Wash Your Soul. He also helped in the restoration efforts in post-war Europe before passing away in New York at the age of 90 on October 20th of 1964, which we will get into soon here. So I'm going to just keep reading some more fun facts and interesting things about Hoover here. Okay, so Herbert Hoover helped save millions from starvation after 2 world wars. And of course, we know some of this already. Although accused by some of reacting callously to the millions of Americans forced onto bread lines during the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was recognized around the world as such a great humanitarian that he was nominated 5 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. After Hoover spearheaded a private effort to ensure the safe return of 120,000 American tourists stranded in Europe at the outbreak of World War I, the United States government recruited him to deliver food to neutral Belgium, where 7 million people faced starvation. Later, Hoover headed the American Relief Administration, which delivered food to tens of millions of people in more than 20 war-torn countries. Between 1921 and 1923, the aid he directed to the famine-stricken Soviet Union fed more than 15 million people daily. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed, he declared to opponents who accused him of aiding communism. After World War II, Democratic President Harry Truman asked the Republican Hoover to circle the globe to coordinate efforts to avert a global famine. He fed more people and saved more lives than any other man in history, said Hoover associate Neil McNeil. So there you have that. Franklin Roosevelt once wished Hoover would become president. Public opinion of Hoover was so high following his humanitarian work during World War I that both Republicans and Democrats courted him as a presidential candidate in 1920. He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president of the United States, wrote Franklin Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. There could not be a better one. 12 years later, the two men became bitter foes for the presidency as Roosevelt defeated Hoover in a landslide. There you have that. I touched on this before Hoover became president. He starred in the first television broadcast in American history. While serving as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge, Hoover's voice and image were transmitted live over telephone wires in the first American demonstration of television on April 7th of 1927. Today we have, in a sense, the transmission of sight for the first time in the world's history, Hoover told a gathering of newspaper reporters and dignitaries in New York City from 200 miles away in Washington, D.C. It's pretty cool, right? I think that's pretty cool that he was the first one ever to be on live television. I found that to be pretty fascinating, at least. Interesting when you start to research all this stuff, and you actually, find out all these different things. It's definitely interesting. So what else here? Regarding that, of course, Hoover had also said, human genius has now destroyed the impotent of distance. I told you that he won the presidency in his first ever election campaign. Before becoming the 31st president, he was just appointed to his previous government position. So when he ran for president and won in 1928, that was the first campaign that he actually ever was elected. There is actually a sport that bears Hoover's name. To keep Hoover physically fit, White House physician Admiral Joel T. Boone developed a game played by the president and his staff each morning on the south lawn of the White House, in which teams of 2 to 4 players threw a 6-pound medicine ball over an 8-foot-high net. Dubbed Hoover Ball by a New York Times reporter in 1931. The sport was played on a court similar to tennis and scored the same, with the exception being that the ball was thrown instead of hit with a racket. It required less skill than tennis, was faster and more vigorous, and therefore gave more exercise in a short time, Herbert Hoover wrote in his memoirs. A National Hoover Bowl championship is held in Hoover's birthplace of West Branch, Iowa, each year. I thought that was pretty cool. I thought this was interesting. He was not invited to the dedication of Hoover Dam. The massive dam on the Colorado River that now bears Hoover's name was approved when he was Secretary of Commerce and was under construction while he was president. While the engineering marvel was originally proposed to be called Hoover Dam, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, claimed Hoover had very little to do with the dam and changed its official name to Boulder Dam. When Roosevelt dedicated the dam on September 30th of 1935, the administration did not invite Hoover to the ceremony, and the president did not even mention his predecessor in his speech. But in 1947, President Harry S. Truman signed a law that restored the original name, Hoover Dam. Interesting. So if anybody ever asks you what was Hoover Dam's original name, you could say Hoover Dam, but it was actually originally changed to Boulder Dam and then back to Hoover Dam. Pretty interesting. What else do I have here for you guys? We know about that. He was a key member of the Harding and Coolidge administration. He won a dominating win in the 1928 election. Of course, he also had one of the most famous campaign slogans, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And he also campaigned in 1928 with a dog named King Tut in an effort to boost his appeal. So, pretty interesting there about Hoover's campaign in 1928. Hoover did understand the dangers of the risky stock market. On taking office in March of 1929, President Herbert Hoover warned people about speculative investing, but by the end of the year, the stock exchanges were in tatters and the Great Depression started. As I had mentioned, he was soundly beaten in the 1932 election, I should say. Although he made great efforts to battle overwhelming economic odds, Hoover quickly lost his popularity as the Great Depression worsened. His 1932 loss to Franklin Roosevelt was as big as his 1928 win. And, Hoover is remembered as the great humanitarian. Hoover was credited with saving 10 million lives during World War I as the leader of U.S. government efforts to send food supplies to war-torn areas of Europe. Later, the former president put aside his differences with Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman to lead relief efforts once again. He was a pretty good humanitarian in that regard. Already touched on a president during the beginning of the Great Depression. Only 7 months after becoming president, America experienced the first major drop in the stock market on what became known as Black Thursday, October 24th of 1929. Black Tuesday soon followed on October 29th of 1929, and the Great Depression had officially begun. The Depression was devastating around the world. In America, unemployment rose to 25%, and Hoover felt that helping businesses would have the effect of helping those hurt the most. However, this was too little too late, and the Depression continued to grow. Hoover saw the Smoot-Hawley tariff devastate international trade. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 that was aimed at protecting American farmers from foreign competition. However, other nations around the world did not take this line down and quickly countered with their own tariffs. So, there you go. The Smoot-Hawley tariff did not go as planned. Hoover dealt with the bonus marchers. Under President Calvin Coolidge, veterans had been awarded bonus insurance. It was to be paid out in 20 years. However, with the Great Depression, approximately 15,000 veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932, demanding immediate payout. Congress did not respond, and the bonus marchers created shantytowns. Hoover sent General Douglas MacArthur to force the veterans to move. They ended up using tanks and tear gas to get them to leave. So that's not exactly a good look for Hoover. And he had important administrative duties after the presidency. Hoover easily lost re-election to FDR due to the effects of the Great Depression, and he came out of retirement in 1946 to help coordinate the food supply to stop famines around the world. In addition, he was chosen to be the chairman of the Hoover Commission from 1947 to 1949, which was tasked with organizing the executive branch of government. So there you go. Some interesting things about Herbert Hoover that I found pretty fascinating, interesting. And now, of course, you know what we're going to get into. We're going to get into the death and the death sites and the burial and the grave site of our 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. We are going to be reading from The President is Dead by Louis Bacone. So, let's get into it. Here we go. From The President is Dead. One can argue that Franklin D. Roosevelt's and John F. Kennedy's funerals were probably full of pomp and ceremony, as their sudden deaths justified such pageantry. Starting with the unsurprising passing of Herbert Hoover at age 90, presidential funerals defaulted to grand, scripted affairs with every song and step planned years in advance and ceremony in the most minute detail, I should say. 2 years after leaving office, Hoover moved into New York's prestigious Waldorf Towers. He was independently wealthy and declined his presidential pension, just as he had refused a salary when he was in office, but could still easily afford the luxury suite in apartment 31A for more than 3 decades. He answered mail, organized his records for his books, he wrote more than 40 in his lifetime, and he remained interested in politics and followed sports, especially football, on his color television. When his health began to fail in the summer of 1962, he spent more time in his home. He also suffered hearing loss, so his assistants became accustomed to yelling at him. When one visitor was dismayed at speaking so loudly to Hoover, he replied in good humor, "I'm used to being hollered at." On Saturday, October 17th of 1964, Hoover began to suffer massive internal bleeding. Working feverishly, doctors were able to temporarily halt the bleeding in his upper intestinal tract. He received frequent blood transfusions, but the strain was too much for Hoover's heart, and the toxins had poisoned his system. The internal bleeding began again, and in the early morning of October 20th, Hoover slipped into a coma. At 8:30 a.m., a medical bulletin was released to the public. Early this morning, bleeding from the upper gastrointestinal tract recurred, placing an unbearable burden upon his already strained vascular system. His heart, which has borne up magnificently throughout the illness, has begun to fail, and its rhythm has become totally irregular. Renal function is inadequate for the demands of his system, and toxic products are accumulating in his bloodstream. The emphasis in this terminal phase of his illness is upon keeping him comfortable and free of pain. 3 hours later, at 11:35 a.m., on Tuesday, October 20th, 1964, with his sons Alan Henry and Herbert Jr. at his bedside, Herbert Hoover passed away. He died as the second oldest president, surpassed only by John Adams, by 176 days. Dr. Michael J. Lepore quickly wrote a note on Waldorf stationery to be conveyed to the press. President Hoover, October 20th, 1964, time 11:35 a.m. Shortly afterward, Hoover's friend Neil McNeil called a press conference on the fourth floor to provide a more detailed statement. New York Mayor Robert Wagner ordered all flags on public buildings to be flown at half-mast for 30 days. President Lyndon Johnson ordered the same for federal buildings and released a sympathetic and personal statement. I shall miss his thoughtful counsel and his kindly spirit. Shortly after I assumed the presidency, after the tragic day in November, he was among the first to volunteer his services and his advice, and they gave me strength and comfort during those trying days. His unquenchable sense of public responsibility for both our nation and our troubled world will stand as an example that will long endure. Hoover's body was taken to Presbyterian Memorial Hospital, where an autopsy was performed. So then, of course, there was a funeral. The coffin was escorted by police to St. Bartholomew's Church, located beside the Waldorf Towers in New York City. So yes, there was a funeral service, and then, of course, the burial. So just to kind of give you an idea, the location of Hoover's death, the original Waldorf Astoria was built in March of 1839, but later razed. Construction of the current building began in 1929, directly above an old loading dock, and the hotel reopened in October of 1931. The Waldorf Astoria is steeped in presidential history. Candidates have attended fundraisers there, sitting presidents have spoken to their constituents, and those who have stayed overnight traditionally leave a treasure for future presidents to cherish. If you are one of the privileged few to enter the presidential suite, you may see Kennedy's rocking chair, eagle wall sconces from Johnson, a desk set donated by Jimmy Carter, and a table from Ronald Reagan. While serving as ambassador to the United Nations, future President George H.W. Bush lived in a penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor. Years earlier, Douglas MacArthur had lived in the same unit from 1951 until his death in 1964. The elder Bush was often visited by his son, future President George W. Bush, who teased him about the luxurious accommodations. And on June 4th of 2012, former President Bill Clinton and current President Barack Obama, or when the book was written, it was current president, but former President Barack Obama made a joint appearance before an exclusive crowd of 50 people, which each paid $40,000 to attend. Herbert Hoover made the hotel his permanent residence shortly after his presidency ended in 1933. During his 3 decades there, he entertained President Truman and future President Nixon. President Kennedy visited on April 27th of 1961, just 10 days after the failed Bay of Pigs plot to overthrow Fidel Castro. Kennedy was seeking words of wisdom from his predecessor. So yeah, I mean, pretty interesting stuff. That is where he died, the Waldorf Astoria, there in New York City. And then, as I said, the funeral was at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church, commonly referred to as St. Bart's. That is where the funeral took place. Hoover's funeral. The church is located at 325 Park Avenue in New York, New York. And then, of course, his gravesite, which we're going to get into here in a second, just to read you a little. The grave, along with Hoover's birthplace and other significant buildings in West Branch, were turned over to the National Park Service in 1968. He has one of the most beautiful presidential graves with an unobstructed view of the home in which he was born. It is, and I will get into that in a second, but I did want to read just this one little thing here. So after the funeral in New York City, At 9:30 a.m. on Sunday, October 25th, the remains were removed from the Capitol and placed in a hearse as the military band played "Abide with Me." So he was brought after the funeral in New York. He was brought to Washington, to the Capitol, where he, was laid to rest, of course. And then after, public viewing and that sort of thing in the Capitol in Washington, the procession slowly departed. The 3rd Infantry Battery fired another 21-gun salute, and then the hearse rode to Washington's National Airport, where a band played "Now the Day is Over," as the coffin was placed in an Army C-130 transport to fly to Hoover's home state of Iowa. And at 2 p.m., the plane arrived at the Cedar Rapids Airport, and a ceremony was held as the coffin was placed in a black hearse, which departed 15 minutes later. It drove 34 miles to West Branch, Iowa, arriving at approximately 3 p.m. So, there you go. And in West Branch, Iowa, as you're seeing now on your screen, the gravesite of Herbert Hoover, it really is. I was not able to go inside of any of the buildings, the museum or the birthplace or anything there. As a matter of fact, I didn't even take any pictures of those buildings, unfortunately. So the building pictures you're seeing are just stock photos that I found on Google. But all the other pictures of the grounds and the gravesite are all mine from last year. And it is. And it's funny that, there are other people that share this sentiment about it being beautiful. And one of those people, believe it or not, was my father. When I did my journey last year all throughout the country to take a look at these famous historical gravesites, I would send all my photos via Facebook Messenger back to my father in New Jersey, who, was battling, his disease. My father, for those of you that don't know, many of you do, he passed away in February of this year, a few months ago. So he loved getting the photos that I would send him, and he loved seeing these photos in these different places and sites. And he remarked, as soon as I sent him Hoover's gravesite photos, he said, "Wow, that is a beautiful gravesite." He said, "That's one of the nicest gravesites you've ever sent me." And yeah, it really is. He wasn't wrong. It is spectacular. It sits up on this grassy knoll, this little hill. It's just beautiful. It's got these paths and these trails that lead, these kind of nature trails back there on the grounds of the museum and property. It's really beautiful. It truly is. I must say, my father was correct. I agree, and I share the same sentiment. I know other people have told me they think it's one of the more pretty and picturesque, if you will, grave sites of any president. So there you have it in West Branch, Iowa. The grave site of Herbert Hoover, our 31st president of the United States. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at the life, presidency, legacy, death, and burial and gravesite of Herbert Hoover, our 31st president. I thank you guys. Thank you so much. Of course, next week we will be back, and we will already be at FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. I don't know if this is going to be a 2-part or possibly even a 3-part video series because, as many of you know, FDR was president for a long time. So, there's a lot to go over and a lot to cover with FDR. So we'll see if we can squeeze it into 2. But if we can't, we'll do 3 parts next week on FDR. Thank you again for all the support. Thank you for the comments, the questions, all of it. Please do me a favor, as I asked. Go to our YouTube channel. Go to our main homepage on our YouTube channel, and you will see a tab, a few things down, about halfway down the screen. You will see a tab that says Community. Click on Community, and then please take the survey. There's 5 answers that you can pick from. It is, which video series would you most like Dead History us to do moving forward? It's vice presidents, that sort of thing. So I am taking that survey very seriously. I would love everyone's feedback, please. I am going to do vice presidents. I will tell you that. And I am 99.9% sure that after this presidential series ends, which will be sometime in August, over the summer, I will probably go right into doing vice presidents after that. However, after that, moving forward, I was going to do declaration signers after the vice presidents. But based on this survey and some of the feedback I've already gotten, a lot of you seem to be very interested in the unsuccessful presidential candidate bids. The people basically who ran for president but lost. A lot of you seem to think that will be fascinating, and I agree, because I'm not just talking about Democratic or Republican parties. I'm talking any party, anybody that was on a presidential ballot in that year. That is who I would cover and go over, and that is whose grave I would also go try to see. So it would be a lot of research and a lot of things I'd be busy with, but I think it would be really fun and something very unique that nobody has ever done on YouTube. I can assure you of that. Because some of the people that ran for president, especially years ago, I've never even heard of, and I'm sure many of you have never even heard of. So it would be quite fascinating. So please go vote for whatever you want. I don't care what it is, vote. I would appreciate it. So there you go. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for all the support. And we will see you next week for FDR. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now. Hey guys, TJ here with Dead History. And behind me, right there, that big building, is the Waldorf Astoria where Herbert Hoover died. Where he lived and he died. Here, I'm going to flip you guys around. So there you go. The Waldorf Astoria here in Manhattan. I'm over here. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. What's it, June? I don't know. June 4th, 5th? I don't know. Something like that. So there it is. That's the Waldorf Astoria. And then right there next to the Waldorf Astoria is St. Bart's. That is where his funeral was held, Herbert Hoover's. I'm going to cross the street here. It's so nice to be in the city at this time of the morning because, you know, the city that never sleeps is sleeping. So, especially on a Sunday. So there you go. There's the Waldorf Astoria. I don't know exactly where the presidential suite is. I would assume it's, you know, somewhere like upper tier. But there is the Waldorf Astoria. And then, of course, this is the beautiful St. Bart's. So that's where Herbert Hoover's funeral was held. Right here in this church. And then, of course, as I said, where he died was right there. So he didn't have to go far. He went from there to there. So there you go. So St. Bart's Church right here in Manhattan, right on Park Avenue. That's where Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, his funeral was held. And the Waldorf Astoria, where he lived and the building he died in. So, thanks guys.